He raised his glass and smiled at me from across that ballroom, and I thought, he has no idea. 300 people filled the Riverside Banquet Hall that evening. His business partners, his country club friends, people who had never once asked what it cost to raise a son alone in a house with a leaking roof and a furnace that quit every January. They were all dressed beautifully. The centerpieces were white orchids. My son looked so handsome standing next to his bride that I had to press my thumbnail into my palm just to hold myself together. And when that man stood up to give his toast, when he adjusted his cufflinks and cleared his throat and said what he said about me, I reached into my clutch, felt the folded paper I had carried for 22 years, and I stood up too. But I need to go back, because none of it makes sense without the beginning. And the beginning starts with a hard hat and a Tuesday morning and the phone call that changed everything. My husband Walter worked for Aldrin Industrial, a chemical processing plant out in Collinsville, Illinois, about 40 minutes from where we lived in Belleville. He had worked there for 11 years when I married him, and another 6 after our son was born. He was a pipe fitter. He knew every valve and coupling in that facility the way some men know the roads back home. He was careful, meticulous, the kind of man who rechecked his work not because he was slow, but because he believed that doing something right the first time was a form of respect. Our son was 4 years old when Walter died. The official report said equipment failure, an unexpected pressure release in processing line 7. Walter was the closest man on the floor. The company sent a representative to our house 3 days later, a young man in a gray suit who sat on our couch and spoke in the careful, practiced tone of someone who had done this before. He expressed condolences. He explained that OSHA had been notified. He left a packet of paperwork and a number to call. What he did not tell me was what I would piece together over the next 2 years, that Aldrin Industrial had known about the fault in that pressure coupling for at least 4 months before the accident, that 2 separate internal safety reports had flagged it, that the plant manager, a man named Dwight Harlan, had signed off on a decision to defer the repair until the next scheduled shutdown, a cost-saving measure, according to the memo I eventually found, because replacing the part during active production would mean halting line 7 for 6 days. 6 days of downtime versus one man's life? I didn't know any of that when Walter died. I was 29 years old with a 4-year-old, a mortgage, and a grief so physical it felt like something had been removed from my chest with bare hands. I went back to work at the school district. I was an administrative assistant at the elementary school, and I raised my son on my salary and Walter's small life insurance payout and the absolute refusal to fall apart in front of my boy. I named him Theodore. Walter had picked a name before he was even born. We called him Theo. Theo grew up knowing his father only through photographs and the stories I told him, that Walter had the best laugh of anyone in any room, that he could fix anything mechanical, that he once drove 4 hours in a snowstorm to bring my mother a casserole when she was sick. I kept Walter's picture on the mantle. I kept his old work jacket in the closet. Some nights after Theo was in bed, I would sit at the kitchen table and talk to Walter, out loud, quietly, just to feel less alone. The years passed, the way years do when you are too busy surviving to count them. I worked at the school district for 18 years. I learned to do the small repairs myself. I watched YouTube tutorials before YouTube tutorials were a thing. I bought a beginner plumbing book from the library sale. I learned what I could afford to figure out and what I needed to call someone for. Theo grew tall and serious and kind. He had Walter's hands, wide palms, careful fingers. He studied hard. He got a scholarship to Southern Illinois University, and I sat in those bleachers at his graduation and cried until the woman next to me handed me a travel pack of tissues. He went into civil engineering. He was good at it. And when he was 26, he came home for Thanksgiving and told me he had met someone. Her name was Bridget. She was a landscape architect. She had red hair and a dry sense of humor. And she looked at my son the way I used to look at Walter, which was all I needed to know. I liked her immediately. I liked the way she argued with Theo about things, not meanly, but substantively, like she respected him enough to disagree. I liked that she called me when she had a question, rather than waiting for Theo to ask it for her. They dated for 2 years. They got engaged on a Sunday morning, apparently over coffee in their apartment. Theo called me right after. I heard it in his voice, that particular quality of happiness that doesn't know what to do with itself. I said, "Put her on the phone." Bridget got on and I said, "Welcome to the family. I hope you know what you're getting into." She laughed and said, "I've been warned." The wedding was set for the following October. The venue was the Riverside Banquet Hall in Springfield, Bridget's hometown. 300 guests. Her family was large and well-connected. Her father, Maxwell Harlan, was a prominent commercial real estate developer in central Illinois, the kind of man whose name appeared on buildings and donor walls, and the programs of charity galas. It was not until I saw that name on the save-the-date card, Maxwell Harlan, that the temperature in my kitchen changed. I sat down. I said the name out loud. I went to the closet in my bedroom, where I keep the things I cannot throw away, and I pulled out the manila folder I had carried from house to house for 22 years. Inside it, copies of the internal safety memos I had eventually obtained through a Freedom of Information request years after the accident, the OSHA correspondence, the legal letters from the attorney I had briefly retained before running out of money to continue. The name on every document, on every signature line, on every deferred decision, D. Harlan, Dwight Harlan. Plant manager, Aldrin Industrial, Collinsville, Illinois. Maxwell Harlan's father. I called the county records office the next morning. I searched online for another 3 hours. Dwight Harlan had retired from Aldrin Industrial in 2009. He had passed away in 2017. But his son Maxwell had inherited everything: the wealth, the properties, the name, the standing in every room he walked into, all of it built on a foundation that included, somewhere underneath it, the decision to defer a $4,000 repair that killed my husband. I sat with this for a long time. I want to be honest about that. I sat with it for 3 weeks. I prayed about it. I called my sister in Memphis and talked around the edges of it without telling her the whole thing. I walked around my neighborhood at night and tried to imagine what Walter would say. What I kept coming back to was this: Theo didn't know. Bridget didn't know. They were in love and planning a wedding, and they had done nothing wrong. The sins of the grandfather were not the sins of the bride. I had no desire to blow apart my son's happiness because of something that had happened before Bridget was old enough to drive. But I also thought about Walter. I thought about the 6 days they weighed his life against. I thought about 4-year-old Theo asking me why Daddy didn't come home. I thought about every January when the furnace quit and I lay awake calculating whether I could make the payment. Every school event I attended alone, every moment I had to be both parents at once because one of them had been taken from us by a man who chose to save money instead of save lives. I did not say anything, but I kept the folder. What happened next, I did not expect. And if I am being fully honest, I did not handle it perfectly. About 2 months before the wedding, Bridget's mother called me. We had met twice by then. Warm phone calls, one dinner in Springfield. She was pleasant, organized, the kind of woman who sends handwritten thank you notes. She called to talk through the rehearsal dinner logistics, and somewhere in that conversation she mentioned that her father-in-law had passed away a few years back, and what a tremendous loss it had been for the family, and how much Maxwell had looked up to him. I said, "Yes," unsure. I did not say more than that. That evening, Theo called me about something unrelated, a question about his grandmother's ring, whether I still had it, whether Bridget might want it for something borrowed. And while we were talking, something in me cracked open just a little, and I said, "Theo, I need to tell you something about Bridget's family." I told him everything, all of it. The safety reports, the deferred repair, his grandfather's signature, the 6 days, what it cost us. There was a long silence. Then my son said, "Mom." I knew. I did not understand at first. I asked him to repeat himself. He said it again. He knew. Not everything, not all the documents, not the specific timeline. But Bridget had found something in her family's old papers 2 years earlier, when Maxwell was cleaning out his father's estate, and she had come to Theo with it quietly, not knowing what to do, and Theo had made the decision, for both of them, not to tell me until after the wedding. He said he was trying to protect me. He said he didn't want the wedding to become about this, didn't want to ask me to sit across from Maxwell Harlan at a rehearsal dinner while carrying that weight. He said, "I was going to tell you, Mom, after everything settled down." I understood his reasoning. I understood that it came from love. But I did not speak to my son for 6 weeks. I need to explain that because I know how it sounds. I know that some people reading this will say I was too hard on him, that he was trying to protect me, that I should have been more forgiving faster. Maybe they're right. But what Theo did, what both of them did, was decide, without asking me, what I could and couldn't handle. They made themselves the guardians of information that was mine. Walter was my husband. That grief belonged to me. And the idea that my son had sat across from Maxwell Harlan at a family dinner, had shaken that man's hand, had let me call Bridget's mother and chat pleasantly about centerpieces while he was carrying that secret. I needed time. I'm not going to apologize for that. But I also want to be clear. I never once blamed Bridget. She had been a child when this happened. She had come to Theo with what she found, confused and frightened, and she had trusted the person she loved to figure out the right thing to do. The wrong decision was not hers. During those 6 weeks, I did 2 things. I called an attorney, a different one this time, an environmental and workplace injury specialist in Chicago, and I asked what could be done, if anything, given that Dwight Harlan was deceased. He told me that civil liability could potentially extend to the estate, that certain documents, if authenticated, could support a wrongful death claim even this many years later, depending on what the statute of limitations looked like with a fraudulent concealment argument. He said he needed to review the file. He called me back 8 days later and said, "Mrs. Kellerman, I think we have something." The second thing I did was call my son. I told him I loved him. I told him I forgave him. And I meant it, fully, without reservation, because I understood that he had done what he thought was right, the same way I had stayed silent for 3 weeks when I found out about Maxwell. The same way his father had checked his work twice on a floor where someone else's shortcuts killed him. We are all doing the best we can with what we know at the time. I believe that. I told him I would be at the wedding. I told him there was something I needed to do while I was there. And I asked him to trust me. He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to let the truth speak for itself." The wedding was beautiful. Bridget walked down the aisle in a dress that caught the October light like something from a painting, and my son's face when he saw her, I will carry that face with me for the rest of my life. They wrote their own vows. Theo's made me laugh and cry at the same time, which is exactly what Walter's would have done. At the reception, I was seated at the family table, the right table, the front table where I belonged, and Maxwell Harlan was seated at the head. I had met him twice before. He was silver-haired, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who seemed to arrive in a room slightly before himself, the energy preceding the body. He was charming in the way of men who have always had things arranged for them. During cocktail hour, he made a remark. I don't want to relive the exact words because they are not the point. What he said amounted to a suggestion, made lightly with a smile, to the group of people standing around us, that Theo had turned out well in spite of his upbringing. A gentle implication that growing up without a father in a working-class household was a deficit that his family's influence had somehow compensated for. People laughed politely. I don't think most of them understood what had just happened. I did. I smiled and said nothing. I held my champagne glass, and I thought of Walter checking his couplings on line 7. I thought of 4-year-old Theo asking me why Daddy wasn't home. I thought of every January, and where Maxwell Harlan stood up for his toast, when he began to speak about legacy and family, and what it meant to build something that lasts. I reached into my clutch. I stood up. He stopped mid-sentence. The room went quiet in that uncertain way. 300 people suddenly unsure whether this was planned. I said, "I'm sorry to interrupt. I just need a moment." I looked directly at Maxwell Harlan. I said, "My name is Patricia Kellerman. My husband, Walter Kellerman, worked for Aldrin Industrial in Collinsville for 17 years. He died on March 14, 2002, in an accident on processing line 7. He was 34 years old. Our son Theo was 4. The room was absolutely still. Your father, Dwight Harlan, was the plant manager who signed off on deferring the repair of the pressure coupling on line 7. Internal safety reports had flagged it for 4 months. The repair cost $4,000. I have the memos. I have the signatures. I've turned them over to an attorney, and as of last week, that attorney has filed a civil claim against the Harlan estate. Maxwell Harlan's face went the color of the white orchid centerpieces. I said, "You spoke just now about legacy. I agree that legacy matters. I want you to know that I don't hold your choices responsible for your father's choices. But I also want every person in this room to understand what it cost one family so that another family could save money on a Tuesday in March. My son built his life without his father. He built it well, not in spite of his upbringing, because of it. Because Walter Kellerman was a good man who taught us all what it looks like to take your work seriously, to not cut corners, to check the coupling twice." I put the champagne glass down. I said, "I wish my son and his bride a long and honest life together. That is the only legacy that matters to me." I sat down. The silence lasted about 5 full seconds. Then someone at the back started clapping. I don't know who, and it moved through the room like something inevitable. Maxwell Harlan did not finish his toast. I won't pretend the rest of the evening was easy. There were conversations I didn't want to have and moments where I wanted to simply disappear into the parking lot and call my sister. Bridget's mother found me near the end of the night. She took my hands and she didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry for all of it. I didn't know either." I believed her. I still do. Theo held me for a long time before he and Bridget left for the night. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The civil case is ongoing. My attorney is cautiously optimistic. The fraudulent concealment argument is strong, and several of the documents bear signatures that are very difficult to explain away. I do not know what will come of it. I am 63 years old, and I have learned not to tie my peace to outcomes I cannot control. What I know is this: I did not spend 22 years carrying that folder because I was bitter. I carried it because Walter deserved to have someone who remembered what happened to him, who remembered not just the man but the circumstances, who refused to let the paperwork and the silence and the passage of time make it disappear into the category of unfortunate accidents. He was not an unfortunate accident. He was a man who checked his work twice. He was a father who picked a name for his son before that son was born. He was 34 years old on a Tuesday morning in March, and someone decided he was worth less than 6 days of downtime. I stood up in that ballroom, and I said his name out loud in front of 300 people, and for the first time in 22 years, I felt the weight of that folder leave my hands. I think Walter would have laughed at the part about the champagne glass. He always said I had a sense of timing. I still think about that folder sometimes, not with the weight it used to carry. Something shifted the night I set it down on that banquet table, but with a kind of quiet wondering. 22 years is a long time to hold something, long enough that you stop noticing the shape of it in your hands. What I've come to understand is that none of what happened to our family was random. Walter died because someone made a choice, a deliberate, documented, signed choice to value money over a man's life. And the consequences of that choice didn't end with him. They moved through time like a slow current, through every January furnace failure, through every school play I attended alone, through every moment Theo grew up without a father to show him how a man carries himself. 'Cause doesn't disappear just because the paperwork says accident. I knew that. I just had to wait long enough for the rest of the world to catch up. What kept me going, and I mean this plainly, without any sentimentality, was not rage. Rage burns out. What kept me going was something closer to integrity, the refusal to let what happened become a thing that was simply absorbed and forgotten. Walter worked carefully. He believed that doing something right was a form of respect for the people around you. I decided, somewhere in those early years, that remembering him accurately was my version of that same thing. Keeping the folder wasn't bitterness, it was honesty. Theo is the proof of that. He grew up without a father, and he became a man who takes his work seriously, who tells the truth even when it costs him something, who chose a partner based on her character rather than her convenience. That didn't happen by accident either. It happened because he watched his mother go to work every day and fix what broke and carry what was heavy and never once pretend that things were fine when they weren't. Children learn what they live with. I wanted him to live with someone who didn't quit. I made mistakes. The 6 weeks of silence after Theo told me he knew, I understand now that I could have moved through that faster, or at least differently. He was trying to protect me the only way he knew how, with the tools he had, and the fact that I raised a son who wanted to protect his mother is not something I should have punished him for. I was wrong to let it go that long. I said so. He heard me. That's what matters. What I want people to take from this story, if they take anything, is that the 3 things that carried me through were not complicated. I tried to do right by the people in my life, even when no one was watching. I paid attention, asked hard questions, and refused to accept unfortunate accident as a complete answer. And I kept going on the days when keeping going was the only choice available. Those aren't virtues from a book. They're just what survival looks like when you decide that the truth is worth the trouble. Walter knew that. He checked his couplings twice on a floor where someone else had stopped checking at all. I think about that every time I sign my name to anything.